Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So on July 1st, not only did Canada celebrate a birthday, but I understand that Chinese Communist Party celebrated 100 years. And there was numerous different articles in the paper about that I found quite intriguing. Issues in regards to quite a big event in Beijing and a non-event in Hong Kong. And so I thought I'd reach out to a friend of mine, Charles Burton, who is an expert on China. He's been a diplomat, a Canadian diplomat in China on two occasions. He's a expert in China because he grew up actually in China, attended Fudan University. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's been a professor at Brock. He's, as I mentioned, been to Fudan University as well as the University of Toronto. So he's got a great education and he grew up in China. Charles, how are you?
It's good to see you, Brian. Happy Canada Day.
Thank you. So tell me, Communist Party of China, 100 years. Is this something to celebrate?
Well, I think that, it's really about the Chinese Communist Party wanting to affirm its legitimacy inside China and to try and set the stage for China's overall global expansion plans by suggesting that this is a strong and powerful regime that should be leading the world. And so we see from that a great demonstration of strength and magnificent ceremonies and fireworks and, people commenting on how great the party has been towards them, plus a number of foreign senior people in foreign countries and foreign political parties praising the Chinese Communist Party for its domestic successes and global leadership. So, it's really about that. Of course, it's also a time for the party to reflect on its 100 years of history and try and come up with some narrative that's convincing as to why China is being ruled by a communist party in this post-Marxist age, a party that came to power ostensibly to represent the interests of the poor, the workers, the peasants, and the soldiers, which now has one of the greatest gaps in income of any country in the world. Over 100 members of the rubber stamp parliament, the National People's Congress, are worth over $1 billion in their personal funds. I think Karl Marx must be rolling in his grave. So it's a complicated time, and I think one that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to manage with a lot of care, but also with a lot of suppression of alternative interpretations of that history. And as you pointed out in your introduction, quite a strong police presence in Hong Kong to prevent the world from seeing how people in Hong Kong feel about now being under the rule of the Chinese Communist regime in Beijing.
Now, I'm only obviously knowledgeable about what I've read in the paper in regards to this. You probably actually heard some of the speeches, but I understand there was a reference to Taiwan again, and that Taiwan should rejoin China. Is this new or is this continuing?
Well, it's always been about Taiwan being a province of China. Inside Taiwan, they have a different interpretation of history that suggests that the mainland's political authority over Taiwan was highly limited in very short periods. And after all, Taiwan was a Japanese colony between 1895 and 1945. And the people in Taiwan are increasingly resentful of the mainlanders, the Nationalist Party, who came down to Taiwan when they were forced off the mainland in 1949 by the communists. So you have a situation where the official Chinese Communist Party's propaganda is that Taiwan is an integral part of the People's Republic of China, temporarily under the control of a rogue regime that must be returned to the embrace of the motherland, and that this is what people in Taiwan are hoping for. Whereas in fact, Taiwan, the people of Taiwan increasingly do not identify as Chinese. And if you ask them who they are, they'll say they're Taiwanese and have no interest in any kind of confederation, not to speak of integration into the People's Republic of China. But, there's always the possibility that China will engage in a military action to bring Taiwan into the People's Republic of China. This would be in the context of China's military growing sufficiently strong that the US would not want to pay the cost of defending Taiwan, and also the enormous cost of a destructive war, as Taiwan as an island is essentially a fortress, and the cost of the occupation when the people in Taiwan are clearly resistant to the idea of Beijing sending down a government to control Taiwan. So, on the one hand, Xi Jinping might see it as marking his legacy in this restoring the integrity of the motherland, or the sacred continent, as they put it. But practically speaking, it would lead to enormous problems for China, both in terms of the logistics of maintaining Taiwan, and also because, for the foreign community, if China destroyed a democratic Taiwan with a highly legitimate government that was brought into power by popular vote of the people, then I think that countries of the world would have a lot more difficulty in engaging with that regime because of what they would have done if this came to pass. So, a long answer to a short question, but it's been an ongoing thing. When I lived in China, many years ago, we used to sing about how we certainly must liberate Taiwan. I think that idea of liberation and bringing about a Marxist revolution in Taiwan is off. But the idea that Taiwan should be ruled from Beijing and shouldn't be an independent democratic state is still very much on the People's Republic of China agenda.
You used to sing about liberating Taiwan. That's fascinating. The other thing that I wanted to chat with you about is that some of the comments that the current leader made in his speech, supposedly in Beijing on July the 1st, were almost threatening to the rest of the world in regards to anyone that would not see China as a major power in the future. I want to talk to you about that next after we just take a break for a few messages. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. On July 1st, not only did Canada enjoy a birthday, but the Chinese Communist Party did, 100 years. And Charles Burton, who is an expert on China, grew up in China, went to Fudan University, has served as a Canadian diplomat in China, a professor at Brock University, and now is a senior fellow at two different organizations, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And Charles, what's the second organization you're a senior fellow at?
I'm with the European Values Center for Security Policy, which is based out of Prague, Czech Republic.
Tell me, what is that organization?
Well, essentially, my work with them is to assist European governments in meeting the challenge of China to their national security. Most of those governments have a lot of experience with Russia, but China is really the coming thing, and I think they're lacking for people who have the expertise to understand the nature of China's threat, and it'll take quite a while for them to develop that expertise. So it makes me in a lot of demand in dealing with the European powers and in advising them on what's going on with China and what they should do about it.
Let me ask you about threat. I don't think many of us are nearly as familiar with the current leadership or leader in China as we may have been with Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping or even Zhou Enlai. But yet this individual has, I understand, been in power longer than most, longer than many thought. And as you mentioned, earlier, that he may be trying to create his legacy. I understand that he showed up on July 1st wearing a Mao suit and said some things that were reasonably threatening to the rest of the world if they stand in China's way. Tell me a little bit about him, about his legacy, and about what we could and should expect from him, if you could.
Yeah, it was interesting that the English translation of his remarks left out some of the lurid threats to crush heads if foreign powers oppose China. I think the Chinese regime feels very much exposed to international criticism. The program of genocide against the Turkic Muslims in the Northwest is attracting increasing attention of the UN and foreign governments. Our own House of Commons passed a resolution unanimously condemning the genocide and suggesting that we shouldn't go to the 2022 Winter Olympics if genocide is still ongoing in China at that time. And then there's the matter of Hong Kong. July 1st, in addition to being Canada Day and the anniversary of the party and the anniversary actually of the founding of the People's Liberation Army, is also the anniversary of China retaking Hong Kong from Britain in July 1st, 1997. And of course, China has not maintained its international obligations with regard to Taiwan, the obligations that were lodged with the UN in the agreement between China and Britain with regard to maintaining Hong Kong's existing political institutions and freedoms for 50 years. China, by putting in a national security law and by closing newspapers that dare to report the truth, have grossly violated that commitment. And I think for the 300,000 Canadians resident in Hong Kong, there's a lot of concern about their own futures in what they thought was going to be a free and open Hong Kong, which is now becoming increasingly integrated into the repressive system of the mainland. And then there's China's expansion into the South China Sea, where China has taken various small reefs and rocks, done some massive land reclamation on that, and put in military bases and ports. And this was condemned as a violation of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Those waters should be international waters. But when the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague came out with a 700-page, carefully argued submission suggesting that, in fact, China should not be taking over those waters, the Chinese discarded it as a useless piece of paper. So, I mean, there are a lot of concerns about China's flouting of the international rules-based order. Here in Canada, we have the issue of the hostage diplomacy strategy to try and get Canada to not abide by our extradition treaty obligation, United States, with regard to the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou and the arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Saver on charges of espionage, which 930 days later have not been articulated, as to they didn't. I mean, frankly, they didn't do any espionage. We're pretty clear on that. And China's imposition of non-tariff barriers to pressure our government again over Ms. Meng using economic coercion in applying spurious non-tariff barriers on the export of Canadian agricultural commodities to China. Who would have known that we sell $3 billion worth of canola seeds to China every year? It's a major hit for our prairie farmers. And the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is trying to restructure the global economy through road and railway and port facilities to restructure the economy towards China, using some practices in the third world which feed on corruption and cause some countries to get into debt situations with China, which China then responds to by taking ownership of some key infrastructure in those nations. And of course, Mr. Xi's overall plan of the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is his idea to reorient the entire global order and render the UN and the WTO increasingly irrelevant in a new China-dominated planet. And, the kind of commentary we saw by the Chinese on the recent G7 and the NATO meeting suggests that they want us to simply discard the idea that those are important international institutions because China's on the rise. The US and its allies, according to Mr. Xi, are in decline, and that we should simply accept that things are going to be done differently in accordance with the values of the Chinese Communist regime. So, the part of the 100th anniversary celebration is really about that, to tell us how things are going to be. And it's all about China's greatness, and that China has norms that are moral equivalents to the liberal democratic norms that we cherish, and that we ought to simply accept that this is inevitable and not try and resist it. So, these are major, major concerns for the future of the planet. And I think the new incoming President Biden has made it clear that his main foreign policy challenge is exactly that: how to bring China into the existing global order, and how to constrain China from violating the rules of reciprocal, fair, and equal diplomatic and trade interaction, to maintain the stability of a world based on freedom, human rights, and honesty in relations between nations. So, that's more or less where it's all standing at the 100th anniversary of the party. Oh, and Mr. Xi has declared himself leader for life, removing the constitutional restrictions on the term limits for Chinese presidents.
So is the current situation that you've described, which is reasonably scary and negative, Mr. Xi scenario, or is this a natural progression of what's been going on in China for a while? And, you're unbelievably knowledgeable and educated on China. But I think, as you know or may remember, I actually spent a couple of weeks in Fudan University myself doing some doctorate courses, and studied the Beijing consensus versus the Washington consensus from a Chinese point of view, which, has some good arguments associated with it. More people were brought out of poverty by Chinese economic expansion in the last, 50 years, 40 years, than in the history of mankind. I went to China in the 1980s, and people were riding bicycles everywhere. And I went to China again in 2008, and everyone was on cars and major freeways and overpasses and expressways and 24 different subway lines in Shanghai. So clearly, from an economic standpoint, China has done something incredibly right.
Oh, I think so. I mean, certainly when I lived in China in the 70s, most of the population was involved in subsistence agriculture. A lot of people were simply concerned about keeping their bodies warm and their bellies full. And when I lived there, everything was rationed: grain, cloth, sugar, everything was subject to rationing. And frankly, we didn't get enough to eat under those rations of the time, particularly for intellectuals who received a lower ration than laboring people. So, the transformation, as you say, is unbelievable. But the question really is, do they need a repressive one-party regime based on the privilege of an elite, which, as I said, is now, engendered a society with such a gap between rich and poor, as in the front ranks of the world in terms of economic injustice, and where you still have a significant fraction of the population living in conditions of poverty without access to social services. How do you justify people having so much money but not redistributing it to citizens who are in desperate need? And previously, in the earlier years, particularly after the death of Chairman Mao in 1976, we anticipated that over time, as China adopted market regulation of the economy, which is what led to this boom, as opposed to the old Leninist state planning system, which is, very inefficient, that China would gradually develop political institutions that would be consistent with the universal norms of the United Nations. So, early on, they started to have elections for the government of villages, and the expectation was that this would gradually move up to, provincial governments, and ultimately general elections for the president of China based on democratic norms. But after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, where the demonstrators for democracy were were crushed by tanks after June 4th, 1989. Our dreams that China would gradually come into compliance with international norms of governance and provide their people with the benefits of citizenship and freedom of expression and freedom of movement, and a society based on merit, not whether or not you're part of the red elite, have been shattered. And under Xi Jinping, even more so, as he imposes more and more Leninist constraints and is less and less responsive to fair and just rule of law, and whose behavior in international areas is more and more disruptive. I mean, how can you justify the arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor? It's a kind of thug activity to engage in political and diplomatic coercion against our government over, a legal process we have with the United States. And increasingly, China is using its power to further its interests, whereas, if China did integrate into the global political economy, if Canadians could feel confident that if they invested in China, that their intellectual property rights and proprietary manufacturing processes would not be stolen by the Chinese regime, and if we had confidence in our dealing with the Chinese government, then of course everyone would benefit, particularly the people of China, who are, after all, the main victims of the arbitrary regime. Particularly ethnic minorities like the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and people who hold religious beliefs who are being very much suppressed under Mr. Xi's government. Crosses are coming off the churches, and mosques have been destroyed, and people just can't fulfill their own, spiritual and personal autonomy under a regime which demands conformity and consistent expressions of praise for the charismatic strongman leader, as we're seeing in China now.
So is this, again, is this China, or is this the current leadership? In the 1980s, going up to the 89 Tiananmen Square massacre, I can't remember who the president was, but there was a sense that this was sort of like a Gorbachev, and that there was a lot of freedom, and there was a lot of encouragement of democracy potential, and there was anticipation that things might change. And was it the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre that then caused some sort of a rebound? And then Xi came in power and is the Chinese equivalent of Putin. Give us a sense of how we look at China and their leadership in a historical context.
Well, I think that's a very significant point that you raised, particularly comparing Russia, the Soviet Russia, with China. Xi Jinping talks a lot about the fall of the Soviet Union and the feeling that they were weak and wouldn't stand for their Marxist-Leninist principles. And so the fact that a Gorbachev came and then the Soviet Union collapsed is a history that China does not want to see paralleled in the People's Republic of China under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And so that's really why Xi has stopped this kind of reformist movement towards more freedom and democracy, which, as someone who lived in China in that period, there was an anticipation of wonderful change coming in the air after the end of the highly repressive Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution campaign and the return of the intellectuals to campus from laboring in the countryside or imprisonment. There was a feeling that we can remake the country into something great. And then the fall of the Soviet Union then caused elements like Xi to come to power, who have applied a more Putin-like control over China, but very much more so enhanced by modern technologies of cameras everywhere with face recognition technology, the ability to monitor all forms of electronic communication, and and absolute no tolerance for any kind of political alternatives being articulated. You know, they've got a list of terms that cannot appear in the press or in universities that came out about 5 or 6 years ago under Document 9. And these are terms like free and fair elections, parliamentary democracy, independence of the judiciary. You know, all of the terms that define our own political system are not even allowed to be considered as alternatives anymore, because they're deemed by the regime to be too dangerous for the stability of the Communist Party's autocratic rule, and massive internet censorship, preventing Chinese people from accessing websites abroad or listening to programs like this.
We're chatting tonight with Charles Burton, who is an expert on China, about the Communist Party in China turning 100. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a couple of minutes with Mr. Burton for some more on the history of China. Stay with us. Real pleasure of mine tonight to reintroduce you to Charles Burton. He is an expert on China. He grew up in China. He went to both University of Toronto as well as Fudan University in Shanghai. He's been a Canadian diplomat in China. He's been a professor at University of Brock. He's been and is a senior fellow of 2 different institutions, that one in Prague, one in Canada, that are both dealing with Chinese issues. And he's been kind enough to appear on my show, I think twice before, talking a little bit about China and what's going on. Charles, why the interest in China? You know, China was like we were always so European focused and worried about the Cold War in Russia. Are things changing? Are we becoming far more interested in and focused on what's going on in China, do you think, or is this just an anomaly?
Well, I mean, China is a rising economic power because of what you're saying. I mean, you get those high growth rates and you multiply by a quarter of all the humanity on the planet, and it has considerable economic heft and has more and more participation in our own country with regard to trade and investment. And I think there's a particular concern about the Chinese regime's reach into Canada. You know, the government of Alberta has stopped all China interactions at 4 of their major universities there for 90 days, pending an assessment of the extent to which university research with Chinese regime-associated funding is actually purloining Canadian sensitive technologies to serve China's military and strategic purposes. So, you know, we're just doing a lot with China, but the Chinese regime is an integrated, coordinated regime which has goals for our country that are not consistent with our own Canadian values. You know, there's desire on the part of the Chinese regime to acquire Canadian mining and energy resources because, you know, with our stable political system and strong rule of law, it's good to source from here. The question is, will China gain a kind of economic coercion over us that will make it hard for us to refuse in future Chinese regime requests to, say, put pipelines from the oil sands to tidewater in BC and reduce our environmental and ecological protection measures over enormous Chinese tankers plying those sensitive waters, and any number of other areas in which China wants Canada to be more sympathetic to their purposes. You know, China does not want Canada to criticize China's violations of human rights, support for non-democratic and rogue regimes in the third world, China's program of espionage and cyber espionage here in Canada, China's harassing of Canadians of Chinese origin and Chinese citizens in our country who should be protected from that by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You know, they've got a lot of demands on us. And the question is, do we, as a country decide that our primary concern with China is to promote Canadian prosperity by getting access to that market and letting all these other concerns about espionage and human rights violations and genocide and expansion in the South China Sea be subordinated to maintaining friendly relations with China by abandoning our commitment to those things, so that we can develop more employment opportunities for Canadians by getting more of our goods and services into that rapidly rising market. So, there are a lot of decisions.
And what do you think the answer is? Should we be more interested in economics, or should we be more interested in democracy, human rights, etc.?
Well, this is a question of, can we deal with that regime in ways that will be fair and reciprocal and beneficial to Canada? And I think right now, a lot of our interactions with China have not been of overall benefit to Canada. There's just too much intellectual property that's being transferred to the Chinese regime through covert or coercive or corrupt means. And we have too many influential Canadians who are recipients of benefits from that regime, board memberships and consultancies and so on, that may be, to maintain those income streams, inclined to try and lobby our government to support Chinese purposes over Canadian purposes. There's just the presence of China in Canada, I think, is much greater than most Canadians appreciate, simply because China has the resources to penetrate our country and to try and use us to serve China's larger scheme, which is, as we said, the community of the common destiny of mankind and the reorientation of the global economy towards Beijing through the Belt and Road program. So far, Canada has not agreed to join the Belt and Road, but we have contributed. We have a commitment, which the Chinese define as being up to $1 billion Canadian to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. There's debate in Canada as to whether we should be providing Canadian money to a Chinese-controlled development scheme that, up to now, none of the projects that are funded by the AIIB have benefited any Canadian suppliers. So, there are just many issues there that we have to look at. And I feel that if we can get some collaboration with our like-minded allies to address China in a concerted way, that it should reduce this tendency of an asymmetrical power relationship where, China, for example, essentially kidnaps two Canadians to try and pressure our government over a political issue, or imposes some non-tariff barriers on our exports to China, and the Canadian government doesn't feel able to do anything in retaliation. But if we could work with, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US, the EU, South Korea, Japan, India, to make it clear to the Chinese government that unless they play according to the accepted norms of diplomacy and trade, that we simply will not be able to engage with them until such time as they're prepared to be engaging in fair and reciprocal and mutually beneficial interaction in a more transparent way. And
help me, if you could, understand why the difference in the Western world's attitude toward China versus USSR/Russia. We had NATO. We seem, even though Russia/USSR had great economic capabilities, at one point in time with natural resources, oil, etc. We seem to have had a concerted effort to restrain their economic growth, and we had a Cold War, and that seemed to have had an impact. None of that do we seem to have applied to China, even though similarly it was a communist entity looking at expanding. So why have we had a very different attitude toward China than the Russia-USSR?
Well, I think the Chinese approach to us is a highly sophisticated engagement, and that we are, frankly, a naive and sometimes greedy people. You know, if you look at the list of diplomats accredited to Canada, the People's Republic of China has a much larger diplomatic cohort here than any other country, including the United States. So, you know, we can only assume that quite a proportion of those diplomats are engaged in influence operations, attempting to get people who are in positions of decision making with regard to China to see things the Chinese way by providing them with benefits over a long period of time that bring them round to that perspective. I think a lot of the people who are in effect representing Chinese interests in China are not even aware of what happened, because, you know, we're talking like 20 years of gradual cultivation, not two. The Russians have a much more conventional espionage approach. And the Chinese, you know how to see the barriers, to see the pressure points, and to stay just inside them. You know, the Chinese Communist Party has a very large institution called the United Front Work Department, which has considerable representation in Canada, and it's really about getting people to support the interests of the Chinese regime, even though it goes against their own you know, national interests or personal interests. You know, this is how they got the capitalists to support the communists in the early period of the regime, and not long after, the capitalists lost all their property and many of them ended up in prison. So, you know, there's an established process of doing this, and I think that the Chinese regime does it very well.
They're good at it. Let's take a step back, if we could, since it's 100 years. And give me a history lesson, if you could. So when I think simplistically about China, I think about sort of four eras. It was the era of Mao Zedong and the Gang of Four and Chou Enlai, et cetera. That was what I would describe as my impression of communist. Then you had Deng Xiaoping, who modernized everything. And then I thought you had, I think it was President Lee, who I thought was moving toward democracy. And then the current evolution that seems to be the equivalent of Putin. Is that sort of how you would think about the eras in the history over the 100 years of China, or how would you describe it?
Oh, yes, I think that, you know, your characterization is correct. But for the 100th anniversary, the Chinese Communist Party have issued a new version of history, which downplays, you know, what was previously officially deemed 10 years of disaster of the Cultural Revolution, doesn't mention the great leap forward famine of the early 60s brought about by Mao's agricultural policies, which resulted in the tragic death by starvation of up to 40 million people in a nation of maybe 600 million at the time.
40 million people, 8%.
It's the largest famine in the history of the planet. But in any event, you know, I think that Mr. Xi does not want a history which shows that a strongman, megalomaniac leader surrounded by sycophants led to bad policy choices, which, you know, would be a way of characterizing Mao in his later years, because that seems to be a bit too close to the core for Mr. Xi, who's now going to be in power for his whole life. And, you know, for those of us who are getting up in years, maybe our judgment starts to fade a bit as we get to age that we normally should be retiring, and who has concentrated power away from the institutions of the state and party into commissions under the president, or more specifically, the party general secretary, which is his real power base. So everything is focused on Mr. Xi, as everything was focused on Chairman Mao.
Where did he come from? How did he amass such power?
Well, I mean, there was, you know, there's only been one peaceful transition of power in China, and that was from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao in 2002. Mr. Xi came through a very sophisticated process of factional fighting and purging of, you know, the security sector, Zhou Yongkang, and the rising leader, the sort of Kennedy of China, Bo Xilai, who's still in prison, who was the party secretary of Chongqing and seemed to be a dynamic and exciting new figure. He comes from the Red leadership. His father, Xi Jinping, was an early period communist, and Mr. Xi grew up in communist privilege throughout his whole life, and was able to rally the Red elite to support his becoming the top man, and has systematically purged any factions or people who might challenge his predominant role. So, as a textbook case of how do you become an all-powerful autocratic dictator, Mr. Xi has learned a lot from past history and has carried it off very well. But that being said, how stable his leadership really is hard to say. As you said, I used to be a professor of political science. None of us predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, at least not in my political science department. We thought that was a stable, strong nation that would go on for a good long time. And, within a matter of months, the thing crumbled like a house of cards. So, maybe while we don't see any alternative to the current political system in China, and it appears to be a very stable system proceeding on its plans for global domination, what the future will bring over the next 15, 20, or 50 years, very much in question.
In my Western liberal ideology, maybe idealism, I always thought that democracy and freedom was the right answer. But it seems like with Putin, with China, with Brazil, with Turkey, even the United States with Trump historically, autocrats have seemed to be unbelievably successful in the last decade, generation, etc. How do you explain that, sir?
I think I think something has gone wrong in democracies because of the increasing gap between a very moneyed oligarchic class and ordinary people who are not seeing the improvements in their life and status that had been anticipated, probably peaking in the 1970s. So, but really, I don't think that ordinary people want anything but the rights of citizenship. I don't think there's a single Chinese person who clicks on a foreign website and gets a 404, you can't access it error, who says, oh, thank you, Party General Secretary Xi, for preventing me from reading this. And people would like to have the right to choose their political leaders, and would have the right to participate in debate about global affairs and domestic matters. And I think they would like a fair and just rule of law based on an independence of the judiciary. I don't think that that's culturally bound. That's just human nature, is that we want to be our own people in charge of our own fate and destiny. And certainly in countries like Taiwan and South Korea and Japan, which are based on the same traditional Confucian values as the People's Republic of China, we've seen very successful transformations to democratic systems, and we can deal with those countries feeling confident that they're honest and based on rule of law and transparency in their leaders. But the Trump phenomenon in the United States, I think, maybe like the collapse of the Soviet Union, really threw us for a loop. I mean, very few people thought that Mr. Trump would be winning that election, and we're looking forward to a Hillary Clinton presidency. And when it happened, we just couldn't understand what had gone wrong. But clearly, Mr. Trump, appeals to a very large proportion of the population, as do the emerging autocratic dictators throughout the world, who are these populist Trump-like figures who have corrupt regimes that scorn the rule of law. So, am I worried? I am. I sometimes feel grateful that I'm more or less at the end of my career and not the beginning, because there are just a lot of things that I just don't know how we're going to deal with them to maintain, the goodness and fairness of our Canadian culture and equal citizenship, which has made our country so great.
We're chatting tonight with Charles Burton. He's an expert on China, talking about the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party and trying to put it into a historical perspective as well as an international perspective. And Charles, you raised some interesting concerns. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments with Charles. And I'm going to ask him to look forward, maybe 25 years to the 125th anniversary of the Communist Party in China, and ask you what you think might happen. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. On July the 1st, China, the Chinese Communist Party celebrated 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And as Charles Burton, an expert on China, has reminded us, not only did Canada celebrate Canada Day, but it was an anniversary of the British, of the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong from the British. So, and it was also, I think, Princess Diana's birthday. So lots of things happened on July the 1st. Charles, you raised a couple of concerns in our last segment in regards to strongmen, autocrats, populists versus democracy and small L liberalism. Go forward 125-year anniversary, so 25 years from now. So sometime in the the late 40s, approaching 2050. What do you think the world is going to be like? What do you think China's going to be like? Are they going to be the number one economy in the world? Is the U.S. still going to be powerful? Is it going to be number two, or will the West have diminished?
Well, I do think, Brian, that the straight line transitions of predictions of the Chinese economy may or may not come to pass. Of course, one hopes for greater prosperity and improving living standards, but there is this middle income trap that so many nations have been caught up in, particularly in Latin America, for example, where you reach a certain per capita income and then it stops just because there are difficulties in technologies and other areas that just don't let them continue to grow and grow. So the Chinese Communist Party is confident they're going to become by far the strongest economy on the planet. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the case. I think I am optimistic about the next 25 years. And the reason for it is that Chinese young people are simply not buying onto the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, the flimsy justifications for maintaining a system based on the elite privilege of the red nobility, as one might put it. That people just...
They're not part of this 100 people that are each worth $1 billion or more, or is that because they actually believe it?
Well, I think the people who are the billionaires are part of the Chinese communist elite. The families of the old leaders that fought the revolution ostensibly on behalf of the peasants, soldiers, and workers are now the people who have unexplained wealth and are driving Lamborghinis and Ferraris around Vancouver and purchasing multiple homes and laundering money through casinos and so on. But for ordinary middle class people, I think that they do share our kind of values, which is they want a say in their politics, they want freedom of expression, they want a society that's based on fairness and equality of access. And I think that ultimately, and I think in the next 25 years, we'll see a triumph of that. And as we've seen in other places, as I mentioned, Taiwan and South Korea and Japan and many other countries, I'm confident that the Chinese people will demand a system of government that's more consistent with the common aspirations of mankind and the principles of the United Nations. So let's get together again in, what's that, 2046 and reassess.
It's interesting because I graduated with my MBA in 1988. And the final exam for one of my courses on business government and the international economy was a cover of Foreign Affairs magazine that said, Japan is going to take over the world. And it was, the question was just discuss. But, if you remember back to 1988, we thought Japan was going to take over the world. Japan was, in the ascendancy from an economic standpoint. And there was something about, what was it? Wasn't Zaibatsu. I can't remember what the name of it was now. But this grouping of businesses that worked together, sort of almost like an industrial mafia or a conglomerate, that seemed to be the more successful way of managing business that we were all worried about. And yet, as we know, it didn't happen. And similarly, you point out, no one predicted that the wall would fall in, what year was it? 1989.
99, yeah.
So that's interesting that you comment that the linear extrapolation may or may not be right.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that there are just too many unknown factors there. And, one always wants to be optimistic, but things do go wrong. And, it did go wrong in Japan. I certainly remember in the 80s, here in St. Catharines, which is a GM town, that everybody was trying to do quality circles and establish management models based on the successful Japanese auto industry, and that's more or less been cast aside. So, I think we have to have faith in the human spirit and the notion of progress, and that ultimately, the people will triumph and will bring about a better society, and we will be freed from the negative aspects of the Chinese Communist Party's rule, that they will, come to terms with the 1989 Tiananmen incident for democracy, that they will do some truth and reconciliation with regard to the ethnic policies, and that China will start to behave in a way consistent with its international obligations in diplomacy and trade. I see this in the future. In any event, speculating any other way just seems too horrendous to talk about, doesn't it?
Okay, so the most important question: if you had a kid going into school today, should they learn as a second language French, Russian, Mandarin?
Oh, we definitely need a lot more people who know Mandarin. Whatever happens in the future, China is just a fact of life, and we need more Canadian expertise who are able to provide our government and security agencies with informed information about the nature of that regime. I mean, imagine if you
So, Charles, the most important question: if you had a child entering school, would you learn as a second language Spanish or Russian or French or Mandarin?
Well, I tried to get my children to learn Mandarin, but they opted for the French. But, I do think that it's very important to Canada's future that we develop a cohort of Canadians who have fluency in the Mandarin language, preferably trained by ourselves and not by the Chinese government's Confucian institutes, because regardless of the future, China is a reality, and Canada has to come to terms with it, both in terms of the positive benefits of engaging more with China in all aspects, including trade and cultural diplomacy and so on, and the negative aspect of being aware of China's security threats to our country and coming up with the right policies and means to try and abate those. And for that, we need people who speak Mandarin. So I had a lot of fun learning it, and it's a great language and a great culture, and I would encourage any young people who have the opportunity to consider that as a career.
Charles Burton, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Good to speak with you.
That's our show for tonight. Good night, everybody.